welcome everyone, and I'm very happy to welcome Roberto Bottini today. I think that this good portion of you already know Roberto, also because he traveled a while around the world, and after Nijmegen, after New York with the Centro, he ended up being a postdoc here. So it is a former Coca colleague. And Roberto is now doing quite interesting stuff in Roberto in Trento, where you are at your third ERC grant in a row. So, but first, congratulations. Second, share your secret. And yeah, welcome. Very happy to hear what you will be telling us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be back here. It makes me remember when I was younger than I am now, but a lot of good memories here in the Caucasus. So I prepared a talk for you. It's kind of an overview talk of what we did in the last 5-6 years, but it's not just a display of different results. It's the result of an effort that I did in the last few months to make sense, basically, what we have observed or what we have of the results that we got. I hope it makes sense. Yes, some people from my lab, and of course, arrived late. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. So, so first, let's start with the topic and what is the problem right on the table. And the problem is the one of relational knowledge. So what is relational knowledge? Is the fact that we don't only remember things or events, but we also know and remember how they are related with each other. Relational knowledge can be spatial relational knowledge, so we all know these different places, but if we know how they are related with each other in space, it's much better if we have to travel, for instance, around Europe. Another example of relational knowledge is temporal relational knowledge. Is a typical temporal succession. If the pictures are scrambled around, that it would make no sense, or at least it would have like a different sense. Then we can have conceptual relational knowledge. And of course, things can be related with each other, concept, objects, in many different ways. Here is a very general example of a similarity, right, in which the two could be, these two animals are more similar compared to the third one. It could be color also, right? And one interesting aspect of human cognition, maybe not only human cognition, is that these relationships are abstract, in the sense that can be factorized from the content that they relate to. And I can change completely the items that are in this relational structure, and you still understand what the relationship are about. So mental representation of abstract relationship across different domains, we can consider that as the fabric of our thinking, right? What allows us to think the way we do usually. And the problem, if you want, is how does the brain implement all of this? So one solution that has been proposed is the one of cognitive maps. The concept of cognitive maps was introduced by Tolman, the previous century, in the mid of the previous century, and is strongly related to the hippocampus and the hippocampal formation, so the neighboring region. It started with as a theory of spatial relational knowledge, but then, as you see, quickly become a more general theory. Why the hippocampus? Because in the hippocampus, there are cells that are spatially selective. So maybe the most famous one is place cells that are found in the hippocampus proper. These are neurons that fire when the animal is in a specific position in the environment. So one cell, one position, another cell, another position, and so on and so forth, tiling the whole space, creating a sort of a map. One synapse is away in the entorhinal cortex, there is another type of neurons that are grid cells. Grid cells have multiple firing fields. So one cell fire when the rodent is here, is there, is there, is there, is there, but not randomly, but they are organized at the vertices of three equilateral triangles. So tiling the space with these hexagonal grid. That's why they're called grid cells. In the hippocampus, though, you find a lot of other different cells that have spatial properties. People refer to that as the hippocampal zoo, because like if you have different species of neurons, the cells get cells, but also head direction cells. It's a very important one, because they fire depending on the direction in which the animal is running, for instance. One cell, one orientation. You have object vector cell, you have reward cells, boundary cells that fire for particular boundaries or obstacles, and so on and so forth, many of them. And all together, they are supposed to create the building blocks of a cognitive map. So a map, an allocentric map of the environment. Now, soon after the discovery of grid cells, people started understanding that these are not only spatial neurons. This is not only the GPS of the brain, but it's much more. And they encode, these neurons encode with the same geometrical properties, also relationships that are not spatial at all. So the first evidence came for time. Right? For instance, in the hippocampus, you find time cells. This is a way in which you can measure certain type of time cells. You put a rat in a 8-shaped maze. There is a treadmill in the middle, and then the task of the rat is to run up in the treadmill. So time goes by, but there is no spatial displacement there. And what you see is that cells in the hippocampus start firing for a specific point in time during the task, beginning of the task, middle of the task, end of the task. And if you then take the same rodents and you put it in an enclosure to let it go around, some of these time cells are also place cells, so they fire for specific places in space. And therefore, same code for a moment in time and a point in space. This is another landmark paper in which rodents, they were trained to press a lever, starts a sound that was either ascending in pitch or descending in pitch, and then to release the lever when a particular note was hit, so a particular sound frequency. They could do that, and what it turns out is that neurons in the hippocampus, they start firing for specific notes, so specific point in this frequency space. And these neurons, some of these neurons, they were also place cells when the rodent was going around. In the entorhinal cortex, neurons, they have multiple firing fields, so they were specific for more than one frequency, simulating the multiple firing fields of grid cells in space. What about humans? In humans, it's not so easy to study single-cell recording. Is possible, but very rare. But luckily, we can assess these neural geometries also with non-invasive neuroimaging, for instance, fMRI. This is the first paper that did that. People were trained to navigate in a virtual reality environment, that's circular virtual space. And they had to go around and forage for objects. There were like a chair there, a bicycle there, a vase there, and so on. They learn the position, then everything disappears, and the task is go back where the bicycle was, right? So you have to remember where and then go back there. In doing this task, you design trajectory in the space, and considering the tiling of the space of grid cells that have this hexagonal symmetry, some of this trajectory would be aligned with the diagonal of the hexagon, therefore lighting up more firing fields and make the cell fire more. Some other trajectory would be misaligned with these, like hitting less firing fields. And therefore, you can compare aligned versus misaligned trajectory as a function of a 60-degree modulation, sinusoidal modulation. And then you see whether there is something in the brain. And what you find is this sinusoidal activity in the entorhinal cortex, like showing the typical, what we call a grid-like code. It's not a grid cell, because of course in fMRI you cannot measure the single cell, but it's a grid-like code that is produced by grid cells population. So now that you have these, you can, liberate your fantasy and then design all the tasks that you want, making people navigate conceptual spaces. And you can create different conceptual spaces, and that's indeed what it has been done in later years. And here you see just some example. This grid-like coding, so this particular neural geometry, they refer to grid cells, emerge when people navigate an odor space in fMRI. They have distinguished different odors that varies according to scent of banana and scent of pine. or they navigate in a completely auditory space or a social space in which they learn just seeing faces of a random character, which character, how pleasant, how popular or competent these people are. They learn by trial and error. And then when they have to make inference on that, they integrate these two dimensions that they have just learned in a two-dimensional space. And making inference about different subjects is like designing trajectories in this space. And you can do the same hexadirectional coding, so the same hexagonal geometry analysis, and you would find hexagonal coding in the entorhinal cortex and in other region of the brain related to the grid code system. Let me give you an example, also to show you how these maps, that's the hypothesis, but there's also evidence that they are important for thinking, they are important for making inference, because otherwise, why would you have a map for that? These are a couple of very recent experiments with monkeys, actually. And here is a typical behavioral economics type of experiments in monkey, in which you have different pictures that are related to different amounts of reward, drop of juice, and other pictures that are related with different probability to get this reward. And the monkey is always presented with two pairs of this. So if you have these, oh, high amount, but it's paired with this one, But if you have like a middle amount and a high probability to get it, then you better choose this second pair compared to the previous one. And so it's a type of a choice that is in some sense naturalistic, because you can see animal probably will need to make this type of decision in the wild. And if you stick electrodes in entorhinal cortex, but also in the media prefrontal cortex, you find grid cells and hexagonal activity while they do this particular task. And if you use, for instance, transcranial ultrasound to deactivate the places in which you have this grid-like code, then the monkey is less able to integrate the two dimensions and therefore to perform well in the task according to an integration coefficient or index that you can develop in different ways. So cognitive maps are a powerful way to compress experience into low-dimensional structures that carry information about the relationship between items, concepts, across potentially all the conceptual domains, as far as we know. And they're useful because they support inference, they support generalization, and in general memory, probably declarative memory. So now, what is the problem here? One of the many problems, or at least this is only the start, if you want, like observing all these different phenomena in different conceptual domains. But actually, we should ask ourselves, what do you do with a cognitive map? So how do you use a cognitive map? Like J.J. Gibson, when he was criticizing in his famous book, the theory of cognitive map, would say, yeah, you have a cognitive map, but then who is reading the map in the brain? How are you actually using it? And this is a very important problem, because it's about understanding how the system actually works mechanistically. And I think that that is, in the long term, what we should understand about any type of cognitive system, not only cognitive maps. So in spatial navigation, cognitive maps are translated basically into action and behavior. Right? That's why you construct that, because as a mammal, as a rodent, or as a monkey, because you want to go where there is a mating, where there is food, away from danger, and so on. A map that cannot be actionable is definitely not useful. During conceptual navigation, how are cognitive maps transformed into thinking, into thought? That's something that we don't know. And in order to do that, we need a model. That's the only way. So why don't to start from all the models that we have for spatial navigation? So there are a lot of computational models that explain cognitive maps in a different way, that can reproduce biologically plausible phenomena in silico. I'm not going into the details of it, but I'm going to explain, I hope in a way that is understandable, something that is common to the large majority of this model. So I do that with a spatial metaphor. Let's say that you go looking for mushrooms. It's something that in Trentino you can do. Not that I do that, right? But you can do. And I think it works like this, right? So you are in this field, and then there are mushrooms here and there. And this is your allocentric cognitive map in the hippocampal formation, right? In which you have all the different mushrooms and how they are related spatially with each other. Right? This map tracks your movement in the space, like place cells, grid cells. They are there because they help you. They help to tell where you are in space. But in order to do that, they need an input. They need what is called an action, or what is called the velocity signal, which is basically a signal that tells the grid system or the cognitive mass system how much you move. And usually it comes from optic flow or vestibular signal that can tell you how fast you are going and in which direction you are going. And this is an egocentric system, right? So you can then move in the space, and as you move in the space, the signal goes to the cognitive map system that integrates that and then move the bump of activity, if you want, in the map where you are supposed to be. That is called path integration. Then imagine that you arrive there and then you see that there is a manica phalloide that is not good, right? So, and then you have been already in that place. So you have already a cognitive map, and you remember that there is a place where there are porcini. Then what you can do is to give what cognitive maps provide with a sort of position code to the egocentric system, and then which is basically a head direction signal, head direction and position code together. And then you can again move, and then there is the cycle, and then there is the velocity signal, and then you move toward the right position, and so on and so forth. As you see, it's a loop. It's basically an action perception loop. So probably J.J. Gibson actually would be happy to see this development in cognitive map. And that's how the system works. And if we think that the same system is used for conceptual navigation, memory, and conceptual knowledge, we cannot just take part of the system that we like and ignore how it's hardwired together. And so far, in the theory of conceptual navigation and conceptual and abstract cognitive map, we lack these two things. There is no the egocentric part, there is not the action part. What we have observed so far is a positional system, is a relational system in the medial temporal lobe. So that is what we need, I think, to provide to understand how the system works all together and to understand how we use this cognitive map and how we think with cognitive. So the first ingredient is the egocentric representation. So you probably know that in spatial navigation, you have at least two major frame of reference. One that is allocentric, you know how things are related with the other things, and is independent object with the other object, and is independent from your perspective, your point of view. I can change my point of view, you always will be north, for instance, compared to me. The other reference frame, major reference frame, is the egocentric reference frames. And this changes with the change in vantage point of the person. Usually, allocentric maps are related with the medial temporal lobe and the egocentric system with the parietal cortex, and they talk with each other. The way we talk with each other has been modeled, right, together with cognitive maps. This is probably one of the most important models, the BB model. You see, you have medial representation here, allocentric, parietal representation, and then in the retrospinal cortex, you have a transformation circuits that transfer or transform information from one reference frame to the other reference frame using the head direction system. Now, another way to provide evidence for these double reference frames, maybe less computationally complex, is looking at hemispatial neglect. And this is a typical example that probably all of you, or most of you, know that is used to provide evidence for this, and also give me the possibility to greet Claudio Luzzatti. And it's the Piazza Duomo experiment in Milano. Right? So you have neglect patients, and you ask the patient, imagine to be in Piazza Duomo and to look at the Duomo, from the other side of the piazza, describe the buildings that you see. And what neglect patients do, they describe only the building on the left, right? Because they're neglecting their imagination, the right side. But if you ask them to change the perspective, right? And describe that again, they would describe always the building on the left, but they are the building that they omitted in the previous description. So this is used as an example, neuropsychological example, to show that people have the memory of the old piazza, they have the relational structure there, but they can access egocentrically only part of this memory. Okay, so the first question is, are there any egocentric code for conceptual knowledge and conceptual navigation, as there are allocentric cognitive maps? And the answer is yes, there is plenty of evidence for that. And maybe it's also evidence that you know. Let's take, for example, time, but this is only one example. You can take many other conceptual domains. Time is organized in part in our mind according to mental timelines, and usually goes from left to right. These emerge in a lab experiment in which people are faster in judging that a sentence refers to the future with the right hand and with the past with the left hand, compared to vice versa. It emerges in spontaneous speech gestures when you just look at other people talking. They say, long time ago it was like that, let's see how it's going to be in the future, gesturing according to the mental timeline. And even there is even evidence with neglect, that neglect patients neglect the left side of time. So if they have to learn events about a fictional character, they tend to forget the events that happened in the past and put them in the future. What was still unknown since a couple of years ago was whether when we navigate 2D cognitive maps, we put in place the same mutually completing egocentric and allocentric system as we do when we spatially navigate. So we set out to investigate that with Simone Viganò, who is now PI in Paris at the Neurospin. And we had these experiments, we call it the molecule experiment. And we told people that they were scientists in a future society in which people are living in peace and prosperity thanks to the discovery of two molecules. One is megamind and the other is megabody. One gives you extra mental strength, the other extra body strength. And as you see, the two molecules are virtually the same except for two things, the color and also the relative length of the upper and the lower molecule bond here. So what they have to do in the task, they were presented with a random configuration of a molecule, so random length of the two bonds, that starts, and the molecule starts morphing at a given velocity with a given rate for 1 second, then stop, and then people, they have to continue morphing the molecule in their mind and decide whether, with the current rate of morphing, at the end it will become one of the two molecules or not. Non è mia. I came by train, so this is it's not my car. So this is a morphing task. It's rather perceptual, but it can be understood, it can be represented as a task. I have to wait. I thought that if I shout, then I could understand. All right, so one way in which you can solve this task, or at least one way in which you can represent this task, is by integrating the two dimension of the upper bond and the lower bond in a two-dimensional space. And then every morphing becomes a trajectory in this two-dimensional space. And therefore, on this trajectory, you can do, for instance, hexadirectional coding analysis, grid cell-like analysis. And indeed, if you go and look in the hippocampus, during this task, in the entorhinal cortex, you find the typical six-fold hexagonal grid-like activity. And it's interesting also that this activity becomes stronger as the trajectory moves toward one of the two goals in the conceptual space. This is interesting because it mirrors something that is also true in rodents, in which you go and measure single grid cells. The grid field becomes fire more strongly around the reward, which can be considered as a goal. But maybe the most important part of this experiment was the egocentric part. So we designed the experiment such that there were basically 7 types of trajectory compared to the goal, right, to the goal molecule. Either you were going straight to the goal, so by morphing, you would actually reach the correct configuration, or you were off goal, and you could be off goal by 45, 90, 35 degrees from one side or from the other side. So you have this type of situation in which these different trajectories that are all off 45 degrees on the right compared to the goal, they have all the same egocentric property. Because compared to the goal, the egocentric bearing, right, is the same, 45 degrees. Although allocentrically, they are all different because they are in different parts of the space. They point to different paths like east, southeast, and so on. And also these are egocentrically similar to this. But again, they have different allocentric property, and even a different goal is the goal is in the opposite side of the space. So if you find a region of the brain that is sensitive to this similarity, so it's considered all these trajectories similar and similar with this trajectory, but different from it, for instance, from these and from these, you found a part of the brain that encode an egocentric-like signature during this conceptual navigation, because people, they were not navigating a 2D space. They were just trying to understand whether a molecule at the end will end up being similar in shape to another molecule, right? Here we are doing geometry on a trajectory in a 2-dimensional space. And this place exists, that is in the parietal cortex, is in the precuneus, and it is the same exact spot that you find coding for egocentric relationship in spatial navigation. So in a virtual reality environment, so a complete spatial task. In this region, if you do representational similarity analysis, or if you do other like adaptation, you find that that is where it's represented whether an object is physically in front of you, on your left, on your right, or how much on your right, and so on. So the same region does the same job, encoding egocentrically information both in physical space and conceptual space. We show the same division of labor between egocentric and allocentric also in a different conceptual domain, which is time, during mental time travel. This is work by Yang Wen. The paper just came out, the revised version a few weeks ago. I don't have time to go through that, but you can take a look if you're interested. So during mental navigation, mental exploration in multidimensional, 2-dimensional conceptual space, the human brain recruits in parallel both egocentric and allocentric representational schemes as it happened during spatial navigation. So we start already having like another piece of the puzzle to construct our action perception or action representation mechanism that you would need to model conceptual navigation as we model spatial navigation. So what is left to do? I think it's left to do to clarify geometrically what it means to have an egocentric point of view in conceptual space, how it is implemented in the brain, what is an action then in conceptual space, and how this information is transferred between the different reference frames. And if we manage to do that, maybe we have something that is equivalent to what does it mean to think using cognitive maps. So let's start for the first one. What does it mean to have an egocentric representation in conceptual space? So here is what we want to do. So we have egocentric representation in perceptual space, and then it's uncontroversial, right? That is relatively easy. The same type of egocentric representation, you have it in imagined space. Right? You can imagine yourself to be in your room or in your kitchen, and of course you construct an egocentric version on it that works more or less in very similar way in which you construct an actual perception. What we want to do is to go further up a level of abstraction and say that the same system is involved when you are making conceptual inferences. And you are engaging in this conceptual space independently of spatial, visual, mental imagery. And ideally, you need a definition of egocentric representation that is good for all these three different situations. What is the definition? So first of all, the first part of the definition, which is not a definition, is that we have many different egocentric frame of reference and not only one. In conceptual space and not in conceptual space. For instance, you have, with the Mente timeline, you have a egocentric representation that is external to a 1D representation. You can have an egocentric representation that is external to a 2D conceptual map, and that could be like a bird's eye view, or it could be the equivalent of looking at a screen, for instance. But you can have also an internal representation, for instance, in a 2D conceptual map. Like in the molecule experiment, your egocentric point of view is tied to the trajectory that you are making in this space. And therefore, the goal is either to the left or to the right to a bunch of degrees. That is what was measuring this signal in the brain. The second property, geometrical property, is that having an egocentric point of view, it means to have a oriented or directional axis that divide the space into a half and impose an asymmetric gradient, such that left is different than right. In this sense, it needs to be asymmetric. So this is very abstract and seems very metaphorical, but let's go step by step. So multiple egocentric reference frames and space bisection that create an asymmetric gradient. So multiple egocentric reference frames, that is very easy, because that's exactly what parietal cortex does. This is an example that I was thinking this morning that maybe I can change it, but imagine when you're driving, you pay attention to the street. So your egocentric representation is head-centered, and then you have to manipulate the radio, and then maybe the tuning of the radio is on the right of your left of your right hand, and therefore you have to switch from a head-centered reference frame to a hand-centered reference frames. It's the same thing when a fly flies on your body, like on your leg, and then you have to use the left hand or the right hand to make it go away. We do this translation between egocentric reference frame continuously in our life. And indeed, there is a ton of experiments showing that, especially in parietal cortex, but not only, there are different neurons that encode the same thing, which is distance and position, relative position, bearing, if you want, across different reference frames. So you have head-centered neuron that tells you whether something is close or far compared to the head, or left or right compared to the head. You have hand-centered neurons, one for each effectors. So this is a type of mechanism in the brain that we know already very well. And at the end is the brain that is making geometry. So the idea is that the same type of mechanism can be used to allocate different point of view in conceptual space. Let's make another example that allows to introduce the asymmetric gradient. The hypothesis is that this asymmetric gradient is given by attention. There are many different ways in which I could introduce that, but I think that the most effective one is using, again, neuropsychology and a phenomenon that is called axis-based neglect. Someone called it also object-centered neglect. And it's the idea that if you have an object in the non-neglected side, you neglect the left part of the object. But the original definition is axis-based, is what used Driver in his original experiments. And that's exactly one of these experiments that we are going to see now. And I think it's a very elegant way to provide evidence to the concept that I'm trying to transmit to you. So this is an equilateral triangle. This equilateral triangle can be seen as an arrow. It can be seen as an arrow pointing down, or an arrow pointing in this direction, like at 2 o'clock, or an arrow pointing this direction, like 10 o'clock. And if you see that if you try to see the arrow pointing in different way, you already see that you're using your attention in a different way when you do that. Now, it turns out that if you put this equilateral triangle in these two different configurations, you bias people to think that the triangle is pointing in one direction or in the other direction. What Driver did is to present this triangle here at fixation, like in this configuration or in this configuration. And then, as you see, there is a little hole in the upper segment here of the triangle. And then asked neglected people to say whether there was a hole or not. So what happened is that in this condition, participants are number of misses. They are much better compared to this condition. So the triangle in egocentric term, in terms of body-centered egocentric term, is always the same. Right? But what happened is that what you are doing, and probably the patient was doing, is bisecting this shape in a given way, like imposing an axis, so that what is left and right usually in neglect referred to the body midline, now it becomes left and right referred to this new axis, which is very completely different from the body midline. So to use Driver words, that's how Driver described that. So it shows that the dividing line between neglected and spared sides, or the orientation of an attentional gradients, that's where I took the word, can be determined by the principal axis assigned to a shape during perception. So if you can assign like this axis, and that's this repercussion, right, to the parietal system and parietal attention, spatial system that is involved in neglect to a shape, I don't see why you cannot assign this axis to a internally constructed shape, if you want, which is a conceptual space. It's basically a conceptual schema that we know to some extent it exists, we could say, and is created in the medial temporal lobe. So the attentional gradient is important also because it allows us to act in the conceptual space, more or less how our body allows us to act in the behavioral space. And this brings us to the next point, which is what does it mean then to act in a conceptual space? You have this egocentric representation, geometric egocentric representation, that is, I think, a plausible way in which the brain could construct this egocentric point of view, and then you need the action, right, to engage this action representation loop in cognitive maps. And the proposal is that at the highest level of abstraction, a mental action is equivalent to an attentional movement within the attentional gradient. Evidence for that. So this is probably an experiment that also some of you may know. We replicated that in 2024. You put some people in a dark room, completely dark, pitch dark, and you ask them to engage in a number generation task. Tell me all the numbers that come to your mind. Let's say you give a range, 1 to 20 or 1 to 12, and so on. And you monitor eye movement while they are doing that. So what happened is that before saying a number that is higher compared to the previous one, they look right. Before saying a number that is smaller compared to the previous one, they look left. The higher the number, the more to the right, and the lower the number, the more to the left. And this is a very strong effect. You can even take the fixation at each number independently of what is said before and after, and just plot it, and you can recover the mental number line. So what I think is going on there is a situation in which you have an external egocentric point of view on a very simple 1D conceptual space. And in this case, this is the attentional gradient. And you are moving your attention left and right in the space in order to move with the space. Let's take another example, the molecule experiment. So if you remember, in the molecule experiment, you have two possible goals. And the morphing is like a trajectory, right, in this space. In this case, the goal is on the right. In this case, also the goal is on the right. So what we did, we monitor eye movement when they were doing this task. We didn't have eye movement in the scanner, so we use deep MRI, which is a current neural network that is trained on eye movement and MRI data, and it basically works as an eye tracker using the MR signal of the ocular bulb. It works very well. And we correlate the position of the eye with the position of the goal compared to the trajectory that you were engaging to in the space. And basically, what happened is that there is a correlation on the horizontal axis. So when in this condition, people were moving their eyes a little bit toward the right. In this condition, people were moving their eyes a little bit toward the left. And there was like a kind of almost monotonic increasing. So this is compatible, again, with a situation in which you have a 2D space, in this case, not a 1D space, and the point of view, right, you move your vantage point, is not external, but is internal. It's on the trajectory, and then you can move your attention toward or away from the goal. Another example, these are different experiments in the lab that is worked by Simone Viganò and Giulia Cristoforetti. And what we did, we gave people two lists of words, like one list of animals and one list of jobs. 16 and 16, memorize it the day before, and then come to the lab. They come to the lab, and then again, pitch dark, eye tracking, sorry. Tell me all the words that you remember from the animals. And they say, oh, yeah, one after the other, following a metronome to be in place. Okay, now the jobs. Okay, jobs. Now the jobs again. Okay, jobs. Now animal, and so on and so forth. So what happened is that even if there was nothing to see, it was not acquired by the task, but people look one part of the space when they retrieve the animal and another part when they retrieve the jobs. It's a phenomenon that we call gaze partition. It's like if they need to separate these two categories that are important for the task, that are task relevant, of course, in their mental space. And indeed, the more they do this separation, and the better they are in the task. So the more unique animals of job are able to record. And interestingly, the same phenomenon you can see also in monkey. This is a very recent paper in 2025. And if I have a little bit of time, I'll tell you the anecdotes of that. So this is Friedman and John Assad group. They have been at MIT, Harvard. They have been doing like 15 years of experiments studying how monkeys create categories, abstract categories. Abstract categories and arbitrary categories. So for instance, you show 3 random shapes. These are category A, 3 other random shapes. These are category B. The monkey has to learn that these are 2 different categories, completely arbitrary, right? And then they go and pick to see where in the brain neurons signal the belonging to one category and the other category. They did that for 15 years. At the point that they realized that all the part of the brain in which they found the neurons that actually code for that, they are also related to oculomotor behavior. And indeed, they reanalyze 15 years of experiments. They always have eye tracking in these experiments because the monkey were asked to keep fixation. And basically, in all these experiments, 11 monkeys, all of them, when they are, and I don't go through the whole task, if you want, we can go into the detail later, but when they are thinking about one category, they look a little bit in one part of the space. When they're thinking about the other category, they look a little bit in the other part of the space, always around fixation, because they are keeping fixation, but they separate, again, partition the two abstract category in the visual space. How much time do I have?
I mean, we can go on. Whether they can go on.
Okay, but there is a lot of other evidence that we have about this, like attentional coding in abstract conceptual space. If you want, we can discuss about that later. But this is basically the message, right? That eye movement and the for attentional movement reflect the structure and the movement in conceptual spaces. What has that to do with the medial temporal lobe? Actually, eye movement and the medial temporal lobe, they are strongly related, especially in primates. If you measure single cell in primates and you look for place cells, you will find very little place cells with the animal going around. First of all, because it's a little bit difficult to do that with a chimpanzee or a monkey that jumps. But they did that with marmosets. Marmosets are monkeys that are big like this, like rats. You can do place coding very well. Very little cells that code for where you are in space. The majority of the cells code for where you are in your visual space. So in monkeys, they become spatial view cells. They're not retinotopic and anything. They just fire. I will have like one for Marco because he's there in my visual space. Independently, if I look there, the cell will always fire where Marco is. Grid cells fire for visual space. This is a 2012 Nature paper in which monkey were just looking at pictures, and grid cells fire when the monkey look here, 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 but according to an hexagon. And also head direction cells in primates and probably human become saccade direction cells. One cell for a saccade in this direction, another for a saccade in this direction, and so on and so forth. And this is true. And this is true also in humans, at least for grid cells, because the other cells haven't been measured yet. Interestingly, you don't even have to move your eye to activate these grid cells. This is an experiment in which monkey, they keep fixation, and then there is a dot going around in the screen, and they have to follow the dot with their covert attention, because then they have to press a button when the dot change color. And even like this, you see grid cell activity. So this is a cell, the fire when the dot is here, 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 and so on and so forth. So it's modulated by attention. And we show this work by Giuliano Giari, which is a postdoc in the lab, that's also true in humans with grid-like coding modulated by attentional movement. All right, so I'm almost done. Let's recap what I tried to say. So what does it mean to have an egocentric point of view in conceptual space? It means an oriented axis that bisects the space and imposes an asymmetric gradient. And different origin and orientation of the axis correspond to different egocentric frame of reference. How is it implemented in the brain? As the brain implements and switches between different egocentric frame of reference in perception and imagination. If you want a little bit of detail, we can discuss that later. It's basically different neurons that triggers for different frame of reference, triggered by a combination of a direction and positional cells. And the translation between and the other is with a gain field mechanism. That's for information. And the attentional origin switches with the switch of frame of reference. What is an action in conceptual space? At the higher level of abstraction is a movement of attention within this attentional gradient. So now the last little thing before I set you free, it's how the transformation between the two things happen. So I give you the simplest case, right? A model of the simplest case, which is the number line and the random number generation task. Ideally, allocentric map in the medial temporal lobe. You are a tree, for instance, you just say tree, so that this is your position. Right? You communicate that to the egocentric map in the parietal cortex. And then there is where you move. Right? So you make an attentional movement or an eye movement in one direction or the other for a given amount. And that creates an efferent copy. At every action create an efferent copy. What I suggest, I don't know, there is no evidence, that is an hypothesis. I think that those attentional movements create efferent copies. And this is sent to the hippocampal entorhinal system, and then you can do the update of the position. Remember? From the mushrooms, then you go to the other point. And then you track where you are. Oh, it's 8. And then you start the cycle again. And I think that this is testable, at least to some extent, with the means that we have now. Giuliano, the postdoc in the lab, is trying to do that. This is ongoing work, but I can show you already the preliminary findings. This is the typical random number generation task. Tell me all the numbers from 1 to 12 or from 12 to 24, different ranges. And they had to say a number every 2 seconds. So the frequency here is 0.5 hertz. There is a metronome that they can follow. 0.5 hertz is a little bit slower compared to the previous experiments because we needed at least 1 second to measure the brain activity and to estimate the power of brain oscillation, in particular theta, because theta is a very important brain oscillation for this type of stuff, for memory, navigation, and so on. So here is the behavioral, the eye movement track. As you see, very strong effect. Right? Here is the magnitude difference between the two numbers, and here is the movement, the position of the eye. So what happened in the brain? We looked at 2 different ROI. Parietal ROI, which is taken from neurosynth. I don't know what it is, but it's a big database from when it gives you like an ROI out of thousands of papers. You write attention, parietal cortex attention, that is the area. So, and that's in the model is the egocentric map. Right? This is where you make the movement, one side or the other. And when you do a regression in the brain, so what is significant here is the effect of magnitude. So here, the power of theta scales with the magnitude of the movement. Right? Higher theta, the bigger is the movement here. What happened instead in the hippocampus? In the hippocampus, remember, this is the allocentric part of the model, in which you should have the maybe also a movement code. It's okay, because you have to update your position, so there will be neurons that can signal that, but you need to have a positional code. That's the most important part of an allocentric map, that tells you where 8 is, where 3 is, independently of what you did before, like a big jump, a short jump. And indeed, what correlates with theta activity this time, both in the left and in the right hippocampus, is value. And value, it means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's theta scales with the position, the allocentric position, in the number map. And things becomes even more interesting if you look at the data time result, right? Instead of doing average of the whole second. And what you see is that here is the precuneus, now bilateral, we put everything together, and you see that the effect is significant 1 second before the utterance of the number. 1 second before, there is the parietal cortex coding for how much you need to move. So this is this part. Then efferent copy, that is the hypothesis, goes to the allocentric map. And indeed, you see that the effect of value, which is the position in which you are here, starts right after and later compared to the movement in the hippocampus. So also temporally, these things, they are aligned. And if you, in this very ugly graph, you put together also the peak of the eye movement effect, you see the first there is the effect of theta in parietal cortex. I know how much I want to move. then the peak of the eye movement effect, I move, and then the peak of theta in the hippocampus, I update the value where I am. Okay, so what I present you is a theory, like a model of how we think using cognitive maps, because not how we think in general, but this particular type of cognitive mechanism. And I think that all of this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So the idea that the neurocognitive mechanism that throughout evolution have been evolved to guide behavior, and that culminated, at least in our branch of the evolutionary tree, in very specific multicellular mechanism in the hippocampal formation of mammals, then it's been accepted to structure and guide thinking, which is a form of acting, or at least is also a form of acting in humans. Okay, I'm done. Thank you for resistance.
Thank you, Roberto. Very interesting. And so, a couple of questions. So it was really intuitive what you did and your interpretation. No, I mean, it sounds with typical things that we say when we are thinking about something abstract and we have some difficulty. And then we say things like, I cannot visualize it. And makes sense because what we are trying to do, it seems, as you explained, that we are trying to exploit some mechanisms that have been built in the brain to navigate space in order to navigate this more abstract situation. And until some process of mapping of this abstract stuff on space didn't work out, then we are stuck. So it seems that there is something important there. And actually, it seems still out of the picture that you were giving us, which is the premise. So you made some examples in which the dimension are pretty obvious. I mean, the most obvious is space. Okay, but then temporal, so it makes sense, no? But there are many other situations in which this is far from obvious, and actually I cannot visualize it, no? And so the question is, where is abstract space, how these abstract spaces are plugged in the hippocampal system? Where are they coming from, this dimension? What part of the brain is elaborating this spatial analogy that then is exploited inside those very well fine-tuned mechanisms for this type of computation? So this is question one.
Yeah, I answer to this because otherwise I will forget if you go with the second one. But one short answer is prefrontal cortex. Right? That will be the shortest one. So you say, what is the cortex that? What is the part of the brain that selects the relevant dimension for the task? That is one possibility. There is evidence that is the case, and indeed it is part of this loop and system. I just didn't talk about that. Then there is maybe part of your question is about the, I don't know, the dimensionality, right, of knowledge, because you say there are some situations that I cannot visualize, and our knowledge is not one-dimensional or two-dimensional usually, right? It's multidimensional. So here there are two ways, I think, to look at that. One way is that when it comes to deliberate, goal-directed, conscious thinking, we tend to collapse the dimensionality, right, and consider a few dimensions at the time. That is the fast thinking, slow thinking. That's the slow thinking part, and this is probably a model of the slow thinking part. What we have. Still, these two systems talk with each other. And also, the hippocampus is actually wired very well to encode high-dimensional knowledge, and in parts probably does. And it works in this system during slow conscious thinking, but it has also to work together with the fast system. So I think we need to find a way to, as you say, to plug in this to more high-dimensional system and representation. There is already some modeling that tries to do that, playing with transformers and distributional semantic system, which at the end is a vectorial space. It's high-dimensional, but there are some concepts that can be translated between the two. And I think that this is a very interesting venue. And a couple of years ago, I think we completely did not know how to do that. Now I start seeing some work that try to put together and integrate these two things. Second question.
Yeah, which is super cool because you already mentioned the critical ingredient, which is directionality. That's a nice spot. So you mentioned that the monkey study, the Friedman group, they look back to their really nice series of categorization. Yeah. And exactly on categorization, we know that when humans try to categorize stuff based on multiple features, they have real troubles. What they try to do is to find one feature, two, or really at most three, and then the system breaks down. So I was wondering whether, well, actually this is related to what you were showing us. So actually what we are trying to do is to map this feature on a system that was built for space. There, the dimensionality is forced to you. And so the system breaks down when you have to consider 5, 10 dimensions at the same time. And so really the categorization is placing a boundary in this space and then navigating through the space, and if you cross the boundary, then it's another thing. And so I was wondering whether this is indeed the case, because this would be very interesting, and whether there's a way out so that our brain can, as we were mentioning, can work not
Yeah. I think it's related to the previous question. I don't know too much about the literature on the formation of arbitrary category. So I don't know what happened when you go. You know that better than me what happened when you go higher dimensional. So I don't have an answer for that. It seems like what is interesting is that in parietal cortex, that's something that some authors have proposed, like Asada and his group in Primis, but also Chris Summerfield, for instance, at Oxford. It says what is interesting, because when you have when you have to represent different categories and you have a bunch of neurons, there are at least 2 ways in which you can do that. Some neurons fire for one category and not for the other. Some other neurons fire for the other category and not for the first one. The way parietal cortex works, and these regions, the Friedman and Assad, but it's not like this. It's kind of a monotonic activity. You have the same bunch of neurons. They fire a little bit for one category, a little bit more for the other category, and way more for the third category. So it's a scalar code, which is very low dimensional. It's the lowest dimensional code that you can find. Right? At the end is 1 dimension. And it's interesting that maybe these region, the parietal cortex, they are also associated, we know, with magnitude, the numbers, all these things that are largely one-dimensional and low-dimensional, at least, and representable with a scalar code. Probably lobe in prefrontal cortex and so on, in that instead they are more flexible in terms of dimensionality. And you can go, that's something that I could say, like, related to this.
I have 3 questions. This is fantastic work. I'm really happy I came. First question is technical. Why is the green cells pattern hexagonal? Why 60 degrees is better? I think the method reason for compressing the code.
Yeah, but the why question is always hard to ask, right? To answer. There is not a final word on it, but basically the hexagonal structure is the structure that allows you to cover the most of space given limited resources, according to geometry of packaging.
It's the same reason why the bees use an hexagonal sense, because they minimize the quantity of blocks of produced.
Yep.
Second is, you remember from the original Mozart work that the grid is tilted by 13.7 degrees, and they propose that this might be the case because of the most complex mathematical reason. So that tilting allows you to avoid having also to encode the corners of the room to be encoded. Did you have an idea whether you could go so deeply as to find that the same tilt in your conceptual maps?
So it's not always like this. It's not always 37 degrees. It depends on the environment, but this related to the environment, when structure, the way you anchor your grid. One interesting thing is that grid cells, they generalize from an environment to the other by rotation. Right? So if you are in environment A and you go in environment B, and they are geometrically identical, but for instance, the smell is different, so the road and nose are two different environments, right? The grid cells rotate on their axis. And then it's believed to be a way to keep the relative relationship, right? So it's a relational code, but then change the absolute relationship. So at least you can pattern separate, right? Do pattern separation if you need, and remember two different episodes, but at the same time generalize the structure. You find that this rotation also in conceptual space.
The last, I promise. How do we rule out the idea that the noise in your eye tracking experiment was virtually nil, so you had a straight line in your plot with one-dimensional space. Say when you went to
The MRI experiment.
Yeah. Carry on. Over.
This one.
No, you don't, yeah.
No?
Noise is much higher.
Noise is very high here. Yeah.
Yeah. While if you go to the linear plot before, I mean the quantum, yes, these ones, the signal to noise ratio is much higher.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you rule out that the eye tracking phenomenon, let's say, is just an epiphenomenon? It doesn't have a causal relationship to the code you're using. Do you plan to do some neuropsychological work on patients and see whether they lose the ability to think conceptually if they have some sort of neglect, for instance?
Yeah, no, I'm not planning to work with patients, but there are some work already in which they constrain eye movement, and you engage in tasks that are similar to this one, and then you are worse. Or you are asked to make some eye movement and then do subtraction, addition, and so on. And if they are not coherent, then you are worse.
Okay.
Now, there are some neuropsychological, like when you damage posterior parietal cortex, you have these, how is it called, the Gatesman syndrome?
Yes.
Probably, where you're not able to understand how many items are in the, right? You cannot count because you can simultaneously, that's that thing. Right, so this related with this is related to not being able to understand what is the structure of things that are going on. And also, the eye movement is a way to look at attention. I think that's the level of explanation is a level of attention. And in principle, you can dissociate these two things. For instance, blind people, there are people that have no eyes, right? Because they have been removed or they are born, anophthalmia without eyes, they probably use the same circuits because they can still move their attention around.
Another question, I mean, I'm not really sure that it has any relevance. I'm just asking for a comment. So I'm interested in the integration between the two frames of reference, egocentric and allocentric. I think there is some evidence that infants and children start with an egocentric frame of reference, and it takes time to switch to an allocentric one to also cognitively move in the space. So there's a cradle of studies in which children persist in turning like on their right even when they move, looking for an interesting object. So I guess these two frames of reference are the brain. So if there is any relevance, I'm not sure. So do you think that to do with preference for one over the other one, or problem of integration, or what, if it has any relevance, but I'm not sure.
It's a good question. The short answer is that I don't know developmentally. I wrote a pre-net 3-4 years ago to study these things in kids. Didn't get it. It seems I can tell you that brain cells in rodents develop starts developing in day 16, 18. Grid cells develop later, few days later. There is evidence that the structure is already there at birth, but the way grid cells and place cells, as we know it, they develop around this time, which, according to people that know about this stuff, don't ask me how they do this calculation, but it's between 2 and 3 years in human maturation of the cortex, which is interesting because it's also the moment in which you start developing episodic memory, as you know, it's sort of theory of mind, this type of very abstract processes. It is possible that that is also where allocentric representation emerge. It seems to be the case because when I was studying to write this grant, I went through the behavioral experiment that been done with paper with kids, and indeed there is evidence that is around that age that when you create experiments where you have you hide toys right under things that are in a room, and then you put back the kid and say, go where the banana was, that's the banana toy. And to do the task allocentrically, it's hard until you get to 2-3 years old. So there might be this, in the egocentric frame of reference is easier, it's most immediate, and actually, to be completely honest, is the only one that we know for sure it exists. Because there is also people that say everything is egocentric. Because in principle, every allocentric representation that we can witness or observe can be explained also egocentrically. With someone that take an axis, remember that axis, and that always bear compared to that axis. And it's much more expensive, right, in terms of computation. Having a map, an allocentric map, and a perspective-independent representation is much easier. That is a possibility. Egocentric start first. That's for sure. I don't know whether I answer.
I'm not completely new.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a question that's more related to what Carlo asked before. So related to how we navigate multidimensional spaces. My interest is especially in the social environment. So you have personality psychologists, people categorize themselves and other person in, let's say, 5 or 6 dimensions. Plus, you have intelligence. Plus, you have abilities. You have, demographics. And I wanted to know what you think about the fact of whether, if I understand, the gist of the thought is that people use this very basic system that we propose for navigating spaces to navigate conceptual spaces. And if you think that in case we need to navigate a complex space that we cannot easily reduce to a lower dimensional space, whether we switch, like we move these 1, 2, maybe 3-dimensional space, but mostly 2-dimensional representation within this higher dimensional space, or whether we kind of abandon this possibility and use another system to move around this higher dimensional spaces.
I think that is the question that I was mentioning before, right? And that and one that I would say we didn't have any answer since a couple of years ago. Now answer starts coming. There are so many, computationally, there are different solutions that you can do. You can do like a linear readout in a high dimensional space. That is a possibility. You can create subspaces, right? Or dimension that becomes relevant. And you have different subspaces that would be different maps. Maybe is a mix of the two. Or maybe not. Maybe you work at the high dimensional space, right? And maybe you use also similar computational principles that are just high dimensional. And to that, you don't have access. So again, it's an idea of a fast system, slow system, that maybe they are working together.
One thing that you said before, actually, Carlo, is that you mentioned that would be like deciding which dimension you would be interested to would be the slow system, right? And then the fast system would operate within the dimensional, so they will be kind of operating always in conjunction.
No. The fast system is something that computes, for instance, the similarity, right, of two concepts in a high dimensional space directly, in a way that cannot be easily explained with grids or maybe place cells. Yes, so that is something that I think we should study. We could see whether we can have neural code, a single neuron code that's fire, so that they provide a positional code for in a high dimensional space in the hippocampus. There is already evidence, it's preprint, and so that could be the case. Also following transformers architecture, so they are contextualized representation and not rigid representation. And that is interesting, right? Because it shows you that there's also this high dimensional geometry. They are there in the same place in which you find this low dimensional geometry. But more than that, like, I don't know, is it like the same system, but we are reading out low dimension in one case, we read out high dimension in the other case. So actually there is no low dimensionality. It's just an artifact of our reading out of it. Is it is actually the case, and it has a separate, I don't know. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
You're aligned on the same.
Thank you for this presentation. It was very, very inspiring. A quick curiosity. We know that there is a relationship between online navigation, spatial navigation, and memory. Is there a space for memory in your model? About memory?
Well, this relational knowledge is relational memory, right? And when you go beyond space and you think about a relationship between different things, that is also memory. Ideally, this system, they are used, for instance, to episodic memory, like mental time travel, like go back in a particular. So to the extent that you are referring to a memory system that encodes relationships, that's it. That's not all, probably, right? But that is this system should be involved to some extent. Now there is a lot of type of memory. There is a perceptual memory that you can do that in the cortex without hippocampal. Motor memory works always probably with association somehow. Synaptic plasticity, that the mechanism are always the same. In this case, it's a little bit more. What you have is a schema, like it's a model-based. It's kind of memory reinforcement learning. Here is model-based reinforcement learning because you have a model there, and not it's just simple association.
So thanks for that. Very, very nice. I have two questions. One is always on memory. The other one is very basic one. Both of them. The first one is you said that attention is like a movement, right? I mean, it's the corresponding of a movement of the conceptual space. So I was wondering whether you think it's more a reflex or can be also kind of anticipatory movement. And the second question was. If I correctly understood, there is a kind of parallel between the perception-action cycle and the perception and, let's say, conceptual action cycle. I think there are also some differences, of course, between receiving the word and retrieving the word. For example, just like the perception can be maybe more continuous, and also you have the signal constant front of the eyes, or and you can also anticipate things like this. So you think that the parallel can be kept along the board, or some dimension?
I can put together your two questions actually because they are actually related. You are completely right. Navigation in space, you perceive things that are always there, that are always available. There is much more availability or continuity, you called it, stability at the end, right? You can use landmarks, and we use landmarks to navigate. Landmarks are used to anchor your map system, right? We know that from studies in rodents, and all of these in the conceptual space, it's not there. You have to continuously retrieve it from memory. It's much more similar to do path integration, dead reckoning, completely blindfolded with no landmark and nothing, that you always have to integrate what you have done and remember what you have done. And it's still perceptually, it's more continuous. It's always there. What does it mean? It means that probably we get lost in our thoughts much more easy than we get lost in physical space. And that's probably true, right? It means that we have to understand how we anchor these maps in conceptual space, and we don't know yet. And probably the anchoring, it's more fleeting, I would say, right? It's harder to do. And that's why when I refer to attention, I say that action at the highest level of abstraction is attention. But as you could see when I'm talking, probably sometimes the action is a real action, also in conceptual space, right? Gestures, co-speed gestures when you talk, right? Time, for instance, is that for past and that for future. Why do you do that? Is that for communication? Probably not, I would say. It's more for you to keep track of what you're doing. And what is keep track of what you're thinking and what you're saying? What is keep track of what you're thinking is not putting landmarks there that help your path integration, help you path integrate through the path that you are to your conceptual path. And also this, like, I think it makes sense in the light of evolution. Because if you look, when you don't know what to do with your life, right? You have to, I take this job or I take this other job, right? You sit down and you think, what a rodent does when it needs to decide, I take this road, this route, or this other route, it rears up and it moves, right, between the two. When a rodent has to time something, or an animal has to time something, this timing behavior is never still doing nothing. It's always doing something, and that action stands for the time that goes. There is a nice paper by, it's called Robert Robbe that shows how this is the case. So there is a level of embodiment, I think, that we also still have when we think. And that's probably, you don't need it. You probably use, we all know embodiment theories, right? You probably use part of your motor system, perceptual system to simulate things. And then you create efferent copies as much as you want, right? And then you can use it then to update, if you have it, like a low-dimensional structure system, more abstract in your medial temporal lobe, in your frontal cortices, prefrontal cortices, to do that with this movement. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes, and so that's why I say at the highest level of abstraction is attention, as a sort of an output system anyway, like a motor system to some extent. So that's.
Good question. I have a naive doubt about this last point. What about curiosity? So if the hypothesis is based on navigation, on exploration, why time is not integrated to begin with? Why focusing on two-dimensional representation? Should it be three-dimensional with the time change of the map to begin with?
Yeah, this is a very foundational question, I think, and it goes back to the perception action loop, basically. Because this is also the way in which you construct the map. Right? It's not that you arrive in a place, you're a rodent, a monkey, or a person, and you know already how things are. Of course, you can have a vista space that is different, but let's say a big place that you have to explore. Right? You need to integrate action after action, what happens in a coherent map, and goes on. And that's also what happened. That's not why you need actions, also to create the map, not only to use the map and to keep track. At the end, action happens in time. And when it integrates like the optic flow, the vestibular signal, and so on in a velocity signal is a direction and speed. And speed is actually the only thing that we can perceive. It's not time. So, and not space. We don't perceive space, we don't perceive time. These are construction. I say the cognitive map is the only way in which you construct schemas, temporal and spatial schemas. There are probably other ways. But what you perceive is speed, velocity, pressure, all these kind of things. And therefore, under that point of view, time is there from the beginning and is constructed together with space. But in a very Aristotelian way, if you want, is constructed through the perception, right? And through the action, through what you do. Now, probably it's not completely Aristotelian. It's also a little bit Platonic, because if you go and look in the entorhinal cortex of rodent pups of 1-2 days, you find some electrical activity in grid cells. That's it's a long story, but it shows that the underlying structure is there already. It's Kantian, right? And the Mosers say, that's Kant in the brain, right? There's a space, the Kantian space. We found the Kantian space in the brain. But under that point of view, space and time are developed together, are constructed together as dimension of experience. John O'Keefe, the Mosers, and so on, discovered these cells for space first, because it's probably easier to do, and it's the first thing that you go and look when you have a freely moving animals, right? Time is more. But then you go and look at time, and you find the same.
There are ways to model that in a three-dimensional space with the third space being time, and speaking.
No, that I don't know. That I don't know of any attempt. Yeah.
The next question.
Roberto is here for a couple of days with the program. Very nice. So if you come up with something, just let us know. And thank you, Roberto.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, people online. No, it's only you.
Sentivo le domande.
Ah, vabbè, normale. Hai un...
Ciao Roberto.
Ciao,
Come stai? Scusa,
bene.
avevo lezione, mi sono
No,
perso
figura, visto che sei arrivato... Dai, grazie, tutto bene?
Sì, sì.
Bene, bene. Sì, ma contento di tornare qua dopo tanti anni. Adesso abbiamo questo doppio lab meeting con Marco nei prossimi 2 giorni. Sarà divertente. Se vuoi passa, non so dove saremo.
Sì.
Anche a Praga.
Magari
Dai, buona serata. Ciao.
Cioè, allora, se vuole mettere che lavorato in casa pranzo, quindi però è abbastanza cosa, noi usiamo metafore spaziali per un po' di il tempo, perché comunque qualche cosa che non possiamo percepire.